In this video, we're going to take a look at the View Transitions API. This is a new web API that's available on some browsers. And this API makes it easy to change what's on a web page in a single step, and it allows these smooth transitions between one state to another. And this is particularly useful in SPA applications, but it's also useful in the context of HTMX. And that's because HTMX will take response HTML and it's going to swap it into the DOM. We want this experience to be as smooth as possible. And in this video, we'll see how we can use the View Transitions API to do that. So let's get started. We're going to look at this documentation that we have here. And this is some documentation from Google Chrome. And we can see the description here of what View Transitions are. It makes it easy to update the DOM in a single step, and it creates an animated transition between the two states. And we can see an example of this below here when an item is clicked on the screen here. Rather than the new content appearing immediately, we have this transition between the old content and the new content. So the question is, why do we need this feature? Because page transitions look great, but they also communicate direction of flow. They make it clear which elements are related from page to page. Now I'm going to go to some documentation from Mozilla, and I'm going to leave this below the video as well. This is how these view transitions work. This is the process. We have an API, and let me make this text a bit bigger here so we can see this. We have an API, and that has a very simple interface. We have this document.start view transition function, and that function, when it's called, is going to take a screenshot of the current page, and then the callback function that's passed into the start view transition function, that will then be invoked, and that's going to cause the DOM to change from one state to another. And then when that callback has finished running and updated the state, we have a promise called update callback done that will fulfill, and then you can respond to the DOM updating. So it kind of works by taking screenshots of the old state and the new state and then animating the transition between those two states. And the API will construct a pseudo element tree with that structure here. Now I'll leave a link to this below the video. I'm not going to go into the details too much. HTMX provides a very simple wrapper around this API. We're going to get to that now and start coding. Now I have VS Code open here, and this is a very simple Django application, but do note that this view transition code will work with any backend as long as you're using HTMX on the front end. Now you can see we have a single view here in this Django app, and it's returning a template called index.html. So let's open that template now, and that has some text that says hello in here. What I'm going to do is create an element here, and this is a main element, and we're going to give this element a class of main content. And this element with that class is going to be what we target in the HTMX response. So we want the response HTML to be swapped into the document at this element with this class. Now I'm going to sketch out a very basic example here. Let's add an H1 tag and imagine that we have a job application system. So job title as an HTMX developer. And I'm using Bootstrap classes here, and that's because I have Bootstrap loaded into this base template here. So we have Bootstrap available, and as well as this H1 tag, I'm going to add a paragraph tag that simply says click below to apply. And below that, we're going to add a button here. So let me copy this button. I'm going to paste that in here. That button says apply. And when we click this button, what we want to see is a form that allows the user to apply for an imaginary job. So in order to see this, I'm going to run the Django development server here, and we don't need a database or any migrations in this application. This is just a demo that's not going to use the database. So now that the server is running, I'm going to save the index.html file, and we're going to go back to the browser here, and you can see this basic page structure. We have the button here. When we click this button, we want to swap this content and replace it with a form that allows the user to submit an application. Now what I'm going to do to start with is go back to VS Code, where I have another template here. It's called applicationform.html, and this extends that base template that contains the HTML boilerplate code as well as that Bootstrap CDN import. And within the content block, I'm going to paste some simple HTML. We have a header tag here containing the text application form, and we have a form with a class of flex column 6. And this form contains two fields. We have an input field of type text, and we also have a text area here, and that's for the imaginary cover letter for this job application. And finally, within the form, we have a submit button as well. Now, normally when you submit a form like this with your data, you would want to send a post request, but we are not actually going to handle the submit in this video. We're just going to demonstrate the view transition, so we're not going to attach a method to this form. Let's save this application form and go back to the page. When we refresh this page, when we click the apply button, obviously nothing is being swapped at the moment because we have no HTMX attributes on the button. So what I'm going to do is open up the HTMX documentation and the section on installing HTMX. What we're going to do is just import it from a CDN. So I'm going to copy this script tag and we're going to go back to VS Code, and in the base template here, just underneath Bootstrap, let's paste in that script tag. So that's going to bring HTMX into the application. It's going to make those HTMX attributes available to us. What we're going to do now is go back to index.html and we're going to target this button here. So let's add some HTMX attributes to the button. Let's say we're going to send a GET request to a particular endpoint. So what I'm going to do is define that endpoint using the Django URL template tag. And we're going to reference a named URL here that we've not created yet. We'll create it in a second, but we're going to call that application form. So the button, when it's clicked, is going to send a GET request to this application form endpoint. And as I said earlier, we want the HX target, the target of the response content, to be that class with main content. So basically we're targeting this main element here, and we want the response to be swapped into the document inside that element. So let's save this file, and now we need to create this URL in the Django application. Go to urls.py here, and we already have one path. I'm going to copy that down below, and I'm going to reference the name here as the same name that we put into the URL template tag. And let's define the path here. It's going to be application form. And finally, we're going to reference an application form view here in the Django application. So it's going to be called application form. And we now need to go to views.py and create that new view. So let's create a function here, and it's going to take the request object, and I'll get another space in between these views. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this code and bring it into this new view. And this is the view that's going to return the response for this HTMX request. And remember, when we click this button here on the page, we want to get the form back. So what the response is going to contain is this application form template here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this template, and I'm going to bring that into views.py and paste that in here. So we're going to render that template, and HTMX is then going to take that response and swap it in at the target, which is this main element here. So let's now test this out. If we go back to the browser and refresh the page, this time when we click the button, you can see that we're getting back the application form, and it contains the two fields. The first one is the text field, so you can imagine writing a name in here, and then a cover letter for why you want to apply for that job. Now what we want to focus on here is the transition between the original state, which is this page here, and the new state, which is the form. You can see that that is not very smooth. It's very much an immediate transition between state 1 and state 2, and the content in state 1 is immediately replaced with the content in state 2, which can be quite jarring, and it can also not be the best user experience, let's say. So how do we add a view transition with HTMX? Now what I'm going to do is go to the HTMX documentation again here, and if we look at the left hand sidebar here, there's a section on swapping. So let's click that, and you can get the documentation for how HTMX actually swaps the returned content into the page. And this is done with the HX swap attribute. What we're going to do is scroll down here, and there's a section on view transitions. And HTMX explains about what these are. They give developers a way to create an animated transition between different DOM states. And HTMX provides a very easy way to work with this new API. What we're going to do is we're going to use this particular option on the HX swap attribute. And you can see above we can also set a configuration variable to true here, and that's going to use these view transitions for all swaps. So if you want to use view transitions for every single response swap, then you can do that. What we're going to do is copy this option, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and this button here that's responsible for sending the GET request, what we're going to do is add an HX swap attribute to that. And I want to swap the outer HTML of this main element, which is the target. We want to swap the outer HTML with the content that's coming back from the Django server. And as well as that, we're going to paste in that transition true property. And what that's going to do, hopefully, is apply a view transition, the browser default view transition between state 1 and state 2. So let's save this file and go back to the browser. And in the application here, if we refresh, this time when we click apply, you can see there's a transition between state 1 and state 2. So this time, rather than the content immediately being loaded from state 2, we have this kind of fade out effect from state 1 and a fade in effect for state 2. And this is the Google Chrome default view transition. You can use this very easily using HTMX. All we've done here is we've used the HX swap attribute. We have the normal swap mechanism here, the swap method, and then we add transition true as an option to the HX swap attribute, and that tells HTMX that we want to use view transitions in order to go from state 1 to the new state coming back from our Django server. Now, as well as the browser default transition, we can apply our own custom animation or our own custom transition between the two states. And what I'm going to do is use a modified version of some code that's been provided on the HTMX documentation. There's actually an essay on view transitions that I'm going to link below the video. This is written by Carlson from HTMX. And one of the sections in this is an example that uses the view transitions API, and it defines some custom CSS animations here, some keyframes and some transitions. And what we're going to do is use a modified version of this. So let's start by copying this style tag that's from this post, and we're going to paste that into the base.html at the top here within the head of the document. Let's paste that in, and that defines the code for these transitions. So let's look through some of this code. We have some keyframes that are defined, and these have a name. The first one is the fade in keyframe, which goes from opacity 0 to opacity 1. And we also have a fade out keyframe here that goes to opacity 0, so it's going from opacity 1 or whatever the opacity is originally defined as to opacity 0. And we have two more keyframes here that are going to be responsible for sliding the content. We have one called slide from right, and that is going to take the content and it's going to move it from 90 pixels to the right hand side. So when this is applied, it's going to start that content 90 pixels to the right, and it's going to go from that state to whatever its final position in the document is going to be. And we have a slide to left keyframe just below there, and that is similar to the above, but instead of going from 90 pixels to the right, it's going to go to 90 pixels to the left. Below that, we have these animations that are using the view transition old and the view transition new properties here. And these represent essentially the screenshots of the content. So the old one is referencing what we have in this form originally, or this page originally. It's this HTMX developer page, and then the new one will be referencing the new content here. So we have two of these in the CSS block, and again these are both given a name here called slide it, and there are two animations defined here. We have this first animation, which is going to use the fade out keyframe, and a second animation that uses the slide to left keyframe. So when we are removing the content on the original page and replacing it, it's going to fade that content out and slide it to the left. And on the new content, which is the HTML form that's coming back from Django, we are applying the fade in keyframe and also the slide from right keyframe. And these are done with particular settings here. For example, the duration of the animation, 600 milliseconds. We have an animation timing function, and that controls how the animation works when it's transitioning from state 1 to state 2. You can have a linear transition, or you can have ease in and ease out transitions, and also more complex functions such as this 𝗬𝗍𝗶𝗹 function. So if you're interested in these, I'll leave a link to the animation property in CSS. That has some good documentation. I'll leave a link to that below the video. And finally, what we're doing is we have some styles that are applied to a class called sample transition. And all we're doing there is adding a view transition name, and we reference the slide it view transition that was used here for the new content and for the old content. So that's a bit complex. I'm not an expert on these animations myself, so hopefully you can read that code and understand that. What we're going to do is save the base.html file, and we can close that off. And what we're going to do is add that sample transition to the classes involved. And these are the classes that are used both as the HX target in the original page, but also we want to add the sample transition class to surround the content coming back from this application form. So I'm actually going to create a div to surround this and give it that class of sample transition. And we can tab all of these over and close that div just below here. So we have that class of sample transition here, and that's what actually defines the view transition and applies it. So we need to use that class both in our original content, and that's in the HX target of that original content, but also in the root of the content that's coming back from the response. So we do that in both places, and then we can save all of these files. Let's now see if this works by going back to this application form, and when we transition from state 1 to state 2, you can see that we have the fade out effect on the original content and the fade in effect here for the new form, but we also have a slide. This original content is sliding to the left, and that's by 90 pixels to the left, and the new content is coming in from 90 pixels to the right. You can see that slide effect when you go from state 1 to state 2. And we can increase some of the properties here. So if I go back to base.html, this is the translate X property, and that's what's responsible for taking the content and moving it along the x-axis, in this case by 90 pixels. So if we want to increase that, we could make that 190 and see what kind of effect that has on the transition that's being applied here. So you can see that we have a greater transition there. The sliding is greater, we have more sliding in that transition, and we can increase these numbers even more. For example, let's make it 490 pixels. If we save that and apply the transition, you can see even more sliding is occurring between the two states. And the point of this is that the sliding effect and the fade out and fade in effect, it's much more smooth than just instantly replacing content with the new content. Now let's finish with a bit of a ridiculous example here. I'm going to go back to the CSS that's in this style block, and I'm going to change the content in this slide to left keyframe. And what this is doing is it's taking the content that's being swapped out of the DOM, and that's the original content that you see here on this page. That's what's being replaced. So what this is doing is it's taking that and it's going from its original position to 490 pixels to the left. Now I'm actually going to decrease this to 150 pixels to the left of its original position. And what I'm going to do is not only add a translate X, but I'm going to add a translate Y property here. And let's say that we wanted to move this 400 pixels down the Y-axis on the page. And I need to remove this semicolon here, and we can then save that. Now let's see if that's going to have any effect at the moment. If we refresh this page and click apply, you can see that not only is it sliding to the left now, it's also sliding down on the y-axis on this page. So that appears to be working. What we're also going to do is add another form of transformation here, and that's a rotation. So what I'm going to do is use the rotate property here, and we can pass to that an angle of rotation. And let's say we wanted to make that angle 360 degrees, and that's one full revolution of a circle. If we go back to the page and save this, when we click apply, you can see that there's some kind of effect where the original form appears to be moving in a circle, but we quickly get it disappearing there. We don't see it moving in a full circle. Let's go back to this. I'm actually going to change this, and we want to make this perform 2 full revolutions. So I'm going to make that 720 degrees. And I want to increase the animation time for this slide to left transition. So what we're going to do is go down, and the slide to left, it's applied on the original content. So it's going to be on the view transition old. And I'm going to change the timing here. And it's for this second animation, and the two animations are separated by the comma. The first one applies the fade out, but the second one is the one we've modified, which is the slide to left animation. Now I'm going to change this from 600 milliseconds to 5600 milliseconds, and I'm also going to add that to the fade out so that we can actually see this being applied. So if the content was to fade out after 600 milliseconds, but the slide to left animation takes 5600 milliseconds, we're not going to see the full animation because it's going to disappear after 600 milliseconds. So we're changing the duration for both of these animations. So let's just save this and go back to the page, and I'm going to test this out now, and you can see we have something quite different appearing now where the rotation is happening twice and the fade out is also happening over 5600 milliseconds. So that is, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that's a good developer experience. And you can see it's not a linear animation either, and that's because it's using this cubic Bezier function here. Now I'm not sure exactly what those parameters mean. I'm not an expert on these transitions, but it appears to start slowly and then it gets faster in the middle, and then it smooths or eases off at the end and gets slower again. We can make this a linear animation by changing this function to linear, and that's one of the options, one of the animation timing function options that are available here. So if we save that and go back to the page, this time it's a linear animation. Each revolution is occurring here, as you can see, and it fades out at the end. And we have other animation functions that are defined, such as ease in. That's going to apply a different style here. So if we click this, you can see it starts very slowly, but it's going to get faster as the animation progresses until the end of the transition. So you can see there's many ways to customize these view transitions between one state and another on the DOM, and this is very useful if you're working with React or Vue applications, but it's also very useful with HTMX. And that's because the whole crux of HTMX is to take content in the DOM and replace it with other content that's coming back from the server, but not in JSON format, in HTML, so it's a hypermedia driven transition. So that's all for this video. I'm going to stop talking and thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying this content, please consider buying a coffee for the channel as well. There's a link in the description. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.